Welcome to this presentation of Lexington Theological Seminary's Conversation on Stewardship and Finances project. This project is funded by a grant from the Lilly Endowment as part of its 2013 Theological School Initiative to address economic challenges facing future ministers. As part of the Conversation on Stewardship and Finances project, LTS partnered with the Christian Church in Kentucky to conduct research to understand the implications of bivocational ministry on the choices and financial viability of clergy and congregations. My name is Kris Bentley, and I'm the director of the project, and the purpose of this presentation is to share some of what we have been learning about bivocational ministry through our research project. Just to give you an overview of the research project, we began in the spring of 2014 when we established a research advisory team made up of seminary faculty, regional church staff, and bivocational pastors. We contracted with the research services of the PCUSA in the spring of 2014 in order to receive some experienced guidance in our research. And after that, we fielded a web-based survey in the summer of 2015, which we compiled and analyzed. And then in the fall of 2015 and into the spring of 2016, we conducted sets of semi-structured interviews at 10 congregations. We interviewed the bivocational solo pastor at the church and 2 of the lay leaders there. And then those interviews were transcribed and analyzed into the summer of 2016. For more than 10 years, the Christian Church in Kentucky has observed a growing number of congregations which intentionally call bivocational ministers, that is, clergy whom the congregation expects to hold some kind of external employment in addition to the ministry to which they've been called by the church. The seminary also knows that many of our students will likely to be bivocational ministers after they graduate. And so the seminary and the Christian Church in Kentucky wanted to know more about the experience of those called to this ministry in order to better prepare them academically and support them more effectively in ministry. When our research advisory team assembled, one of our first questions was, what do we mean when we talk about bivocational ministry? And so the members of our team spent some time asking ourselves what bivocational ministry meant to us. And we also did some reading about bivocational ministry. We found that many different terms are used across the span of various Christian traditions regarding this ministry that we call bivocational. Some of these that are listed might be familiar to you. But when we spoke with those who were serving as bivocational ministers, they told us one thing very clearly, that they did not think the term part-time ministry was a good way to describe their ministry. The research team developed its own working definition to use in the research. We wanted to be sure to include people who were licensed, commissioned, or ordained in our tradition. We also wanted to make sure that the other employment that people had outside the church could be part-time or full-time. And this definition, which is bivocational ministers are individuals who are licensed, commissioned, or ordained ministers serving in a congregation who also receive income through employment outside the congregation. We shared this definition a bit before we began our research and got some feedback. In the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, there are 3 ordination statuses. Licensed, which means a person is usually serving just one congregation. Often students are licensed and serve in this category. Commissioned, which may mean a person is involved in some education, but also is usually serving in congregations in one region. rather than throughout the entire denomination, and also ordained, which allows individuals to serve in all the regions of our denomination. And ministers in all three categories have approval to serve congregations and are involved in the ministry inside the Christian church in Kentucky. The first step of the project was to develop and field our web-based survey. This survey asked a wide variety of questions about congregational life and about the pastor's personal finances and also their clergy compensation. Who took this survey? Well, we administered it to all active Christian Church Disciples of Christ ministers who were in good standing in Kentucky and were also serving Christian Church Disciples of Christ congregations. They were all invited to participate in the survey. The survey was primarily delivered through the internet, but there were some ministers who didn't have internet addresses, and they were invited to participate through in a paper survey, which was analyzed in the same way. We had a 60% response rate for the survey. Part of the survey also asked respondents whether they were bivocational ministers or not. First, they were asked whether they considered themselves to be bivocational ministers, and next they were given the project's definition of bivocational ministry and asked if this definition fit their current ministry, and 40% of those who responded to the survey said yes, and so this allowed us to compare responses for single vocation and bivocational pastors, and we also had some additional questions that were just for the bivocational ministers to respond to. We found that in demographic terms, single and bivocational ministers in Kentucky are similar, very similar. Currently, active Disciples of Christ pastors are predominantly white, male and married, and between the ages of 41 through 70. And bivocational pastors do not differ from the other pastors in terms of sex, race, ethnicity, or marital status. However, they do differ by age. When we looked at the bivocational ministers, 80% of them are 50 years and older. In comparison, only 49% of the single vocation pastors are over the age of 50. And the statistics here show you the demographics for the overall population of pastors who responded to the survey. Because we were interested in financial stability, we also asked questions about household size and how many dependents pastors had in their households, and we found that household sizes ranged from 1 to 6 people, with 48% of the households comprised of just 2 individuals. The most common living arrangement within this population was a married couple with no children at home, and this was the same for single and bivocational pastors. Overall, the pastors are well educated. 68% of the entire population have a master's degree, and an additional 17% have a doctorate. But when we looked and compared the bivocational and single vocational pastors, we found that bivocational pastors are significantly less likely to have master's degrees or a doctorate compared to 97% of single vocation pastors who do. Only 67% of bivocational pastors have either a master's degree or a doctorate degree. When asked about ordination status, we also found a difference between the single vocation and bivocational pastors. In the overall population, 4 in 5 are ordained. But when we look just at bivocational pastors, we see that they are much more likely to be licensed or commissioned than are single vocational pastors, whereas single vocation pastors are overwhelmingly ordained. When the survey recipients were asked to pick an option that best described their current ministry, over half of the ministers, 55%, selected solo pastors. However, when we look at bivocational pastors and compare them to single vocation pastors, we see that bivocational ministers are much more likely to be solo pastors. 73% of bivocational pastors are solo pastors. There are no bivocational pastors that classified themselves as lead pastor of a multi-minister staff, whereas in the single vocation pastors, 25% of that population is. Also, in terms of congregational type, which isn't pictured on this slide, bivocational pastors are more likely to serve in rural congregations with fewer than 50 in attendance in weekly worship, whereas single vocation pastors serve most commonly in congregations in small towns and in congregations with more than 50 in attendance in weekly worship. In order to learn more about financial stability, the survey included a number of questions about personal finances, household finances, and compensation from the church. One that was very interesting was when we asked them to give their household income. They were given 6 income ranges to choose from, and we see in this graph that distribution. There wasn't a real difference between the household income of bivocational pastors and single vocation pastors. However, when we asked about salary at the church, not including housing allowance or other benefits, we did see a difference between the salary that bivocational and single vocation pastors receive from their congregation, as you can see in this bottom bar graph. But what this does show us is, even though the salary is different, which would be expected, bivocational pastors are successfully supplementing their income to make their household income similar to that of single vocation pastors. And in a September 2016 report, we learned that the median household income in the U.S. in 2015 was $56,500. And so we can look at this and compare the household income here for the pastors we surveyed. In Kentucky, the median household income in 2015 was $45,215. When asked about debt and repayment, we learned that debt is not generally a problem among the pastors in the survey population. We did learn, however, that consumer debt plays a bigger role in pastors' lives than does educational debt, as you can see in these 2 pie charts. When we did look at educational debt and compare bivocational and single vocation pastors, we did see that single vocation pastors are more likely to carry educational debt than are bivocational pastors. 26% of single vocation pastors have educational debt that they are repaying, whereas bivocational pastors it's only 9%. And this could reflect the slightly younger age of the population of single vocation pastors, and the older bivocational pastor group had a longer time to pay back their educational debt. One of the questions asked specifically of bivocational ministers was about their level of satisfaction with bivocational ministry. And the majority of bivocational ministers who responded to this survey expressed levels of satisfaction. It was 82%. In another question, the bivocational ministers were asked if they would continue bivocational ministry even if offered other opportunities, and half of them said that they would. They would continue to do that. Bivocational ministers were also given a list of 10 possible reasons to serve as a bivocational minister, and they were asked to select the top 3 that applied to them. And of the 10 reasons offered, the top 3 are family demands or needs, 40% listed that, financial decision, 40% listed that, and called to bivocational ministry, 37% listed that. They were also allowed to write in up to 3 reasons, and 83% of the bivocational ministers wrote in their own reasons for serving as a bivocational pastor. And although some of the written reasons that respondents give for why they serve as a bivocational minister regard some level of necessity, such as the need for health insurance, they can't find a full-time job locally, a part-time job serving the congregation doesn't pay enough, 9 of the 20 written responses are specifically about choosing bivocational ministry. For instance, one response was, I feel called to serve smaller churches that cannot afford to pay the salary and benefits regular ordained clergy require. These small, mostly rural congregations deserve quality of ministry and service the same as larger congregations, and I can financially afford to do that. So we did have a number of different responses along those lines. The survey also asked the question, are there any other factors related to your work you would like to share? And a variety of comments were shared. Some spoke of challenges, some spoke of different issues within the church, but some also gave a little glimpse into the life of bivocational ministry. This one in particular did that. This bivocational minister says, I didn't anticipate but rather enjoy that being bivocational carries some advantages for the pastor. The fact that most of my income comes from outside the church frees up money for the church to do other things. Also, having other income gives me the freedom to have a more prophetic voice within the congregation. In other words, they don't own me. The second part of our research involved semi-structured interviews with 10 solo bivocational pastors and 2 lay leaders at the congregation where they serve. All these bivocational pastors were also people who had responded to the web-based survey. Lots of things came up in these conversations. We had set questions, which we always asked the same questions of each group. The interviews with the pastors lasted about an hour, and the interview with the lay leaders lasted about an hour as well. We spoke to the lay leaders together. We talked about things like congregational practices, what made their congregation unique, church finances, stewardship practices. We talked about the compensation of their pastor, how the lay leaders felt about that, how the pastor felt about his or her compensation. And in addition, the pastors were also asked to share their stories of call to the ministry. This group of 10 pastors were primarily people who had expressed satisfaction with being bivocational. 8 of them were serving in established congregations that had their own buildings. 2 of them were working in situations where the churches were either new or in a transitional stage and were working with very limited resources. These 2 congregations did not own their own buildings. But in all 10 situations, the congregation leaders who were interviewed and the pastors interviewed indicated that they had a strong relationship between the pastor and the congregation, and that bivocational ministry was working well for them. It was, in fact, a significant dimension of their ministry together. Here you can see from the demographic chart here that most of the group were men. We did interview 1 woman pastor. When we look at ordination status, only half the group was ordained. 2 were licensed ministers. They had each served in the one congregation where they currently were serving, and they had served there for each of them for more than 20 years. The 3 commissioned ministers had pursued education after they'd already been involved in the other employment, and some of them had served more than one congregation. The 5 ordained pastors, who were also MDiv pastors, They had served several congregations, but for two of those pastors, this was their first time serving in a bivocational setting. In all cases, their other employment was varied. 5 out of the 10 were involved in educational settings in some way, either secondary school, public and private, or higher education. 4 worked in a private business setting, and 1 was self-employed. 7 of the 10 congregations were small rural congregations, and 3 of the 10 congregations were in larger towns or cities. Talking to these ministers and lay leaders was very interesting. We heard great stories of congregational life, and we heard great stories about men and women being called to the ministry and to serve the congregations that they were serving. And we hope to share more about those particular narratives in the future as we continue to work with our research. We did find 3 themes in the stories of the call to ministry, even though each pastor had very different stories. First off, the calls to ministry to these bivocational settings were often in response to a specific congregation's need. A congregation, for instance, may know that they need to call a pastor. They know of someone in the community who's been very active in church life in another congregation but is not currently a minister, and so they reached out to those people. And that's how some of these ministers actually took the first step into ministry, and this was for both licensed and commissioned individuals. Also, for several of the bivocational ministers we interviewed, their other position, their other employment is what they not only had primarily, but it took the primary amount of their energy. So they consider their ministry in the church to be their second vocation. But also, they all spoke of ways that being bivocational gives ministers a unique relationship to their congregation. All in all, we've felt that far from being a barrier to good pastoring, these interviewees felt strongly that being bivocational created space for a very fulfilling and special relationship between the pastor and the congregation. In short, they felt that because the pastor did not rely on the congregation for livelihood, the pastor was empowered to engage with the congregation on equal footing. As lay leaders reflected on having a bivocational pastor, they shared a number of things. They said that not having to support a pastor's family fully on their own really helped them to get by financially. They also told stories about how having a minister who also worked in the community actually increased their visibility as a church, as a congregation in the community, because that person was out there mingling with people during the week. A number of them spoke that the other job that their pastor had gave him or her real-world experience and skills that they benefited from in their congregational life. And many of them spoke about how having a pastor who wasn't there all the time really helped strengthen their lay leadership in their congregation. As pastors reflected on their experiences of being bivocational, they noted a number of things as well. Several of them felt that being bivocational made them actually a better minister. It helped them to pay more attention to time management. It helped them get out into the community more and think about things from different perspectives because they were in different settings. Many of them also said that the scheduling was very challenging. Some of them had to commute a little way to their congregations, so they had to take that into consideration, but also just balancing family responsibilities sometimes with one job, 2 jobs, or in some cases more than 2 jobs. that was really a big challenge of being a bivocational minister. A number of them found that technology really helped with this. Having remote access to to their other job meant that they could be flexible. Sometimes they could be actually at the church when they were connecting with people in their other position. Cell phones, internet, things like that. Some of them did admit, though, that they felt that sometimes they believed maybe some ministry wasn't getting done. Maybe there were things that were falling between the cracks. But also, just as the lay people, strong lay leadership was key, they felt. And when you had a strong network of lay leaders who was, especially if you were in a congregation where they'd been bivocational pastors for several times, that they knew how to handle things, they knew how to communicate very well, and that helped the bivocational pastor be very much more successful. There's more to learn and more to share, but the experiences of these 10 interviews with the pastors and lay leaders have revealed that even though some may come to bivocational ministry with an assumption that it's not quite as good as single vocational pastoring, that these stories have told us that they have not experienced it that way. They have actually felt that it has been a real strength in their congregational life. We thank you for spending some time listening to what we are learning from bivocational ministers.